Let me just start the broadcast like this. Democratic Party platform officially calls for prosecuting man-made global warming skeptics. So we point out that all these UN heads and people are making massive amounts of money off carbon taxes, and it's all a giant scam. You point out that the sun is the main driver of climate. They want you arrested. We know the Democrats have been pushing that here. They've been pushing it in Europe. But it doesn't matter that we found their emails that got hacked 6 years ago showing major universities coordinating with the UN to, quote, hide the decline. None of that really matters because they just want to arrest those of us that call them out for being the criminals they are. And the communist Chinese have come out and announced incredible internet censorship, including of Western companies that don't submit to their guidelines. And Reuters and others come out and kind of write about it like it's an okay thing because they don't want to be censored in China. In the past, as bad as our media has been, they wouldn't join with the communist Chinese government that has mobile execution vans in every city killing political dissidents and executing you if they find out you're a closet Buddhist. Who have the Buddhists attacked ever? So this is what we're dealing with here, is just incredible totalitarianism galloping. And by the way, we didn't predict accurately what the EU was going to do if there was a pro-British exit from the euro. We knew what they would do. They would try to trigger clauses that they have claiming that if you don't have 75% for an exit, you're not allowed to leave. The UK never got to vote to enter. Out of 25 that have entered the EU, only 2 of them ever had a vote. Other countries have voted to get out, and when they vote to get out, they're not allowed to get out. Now, that's called being a prisoner. England has its own military, and this is what's incredible about a Zero Hedge story up on Infowars.com. We're going to be covering it in detail. They themselves say their answer is a new superstate. That's what George Soros called for yesterday, and they're telling members that haven't left yet, we're abolishing your militaries, and next is your police, the final phase of occupation. EU response to British exit, the Brexit, totalitarian superstate. Kurt Nemo's written a story about it at Infowars.com. Measure will strip sovereignty of member states. And the New Americans reporting on it, Zero Hedge is reporting on it. It is simply mind-blowing. And this is what's being said. I mean, we knew they'd do it. We knew they'd come out and say, oh, sorry, it wasn't 75%, or another member state of your United Kingdom, Scotland didn't vote to do it, so they can block you, or we're going to hold your bank account money, or we're going to blockade your trade. Well, Europe is teetering just as bad as the UK is under globalist control. So England should play gutsball with these EU bureaucrats and say, listen, you unelected slimes. The only difference between you and Hitler is you're not driving Panzer tanks and don't have Stukas dive bombing Krakow and London and Leningrad. Civil uprising escalates as 8 EU nations threaten referendum as the 8th nation joins it, and their response is, hey, we're coming with our military. The EU overthrew 2.5 years ago Ukraine, an elected government, installed right-wing fascists that actually Heil Hitler, and then they invaded the East so hardcore that's always been Russian-held that the Russians begged and seceded. And then they call that Russian aggression. Listen, I'm an American. I don't have a dog in this fight other than the fact that I don't want to be part of a country that's assigned to NATO and the UN and the EU that are running around starting World War III. And the Russians have come out, Putin came out in a statement and said this is similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is. An unelected, criminal, totalitarian, socialist, communist, militaristic, power-grabbing, out-of-control organization. That fits the EU to a T. It fits the old Soviet Union to a T. The EU needs to be destroyed. The story's linked up at DrudgeReport.com. It's linked up on Infowars.com as well. The Daily Caller. Democratic Party platform calls for prosecuting global warming skeptics, and they have the subsection there and even a video of them talking about how wonderful it's going to be. That is the criminal persecution of the American people in line with what the UN's been saying they want. If you come out and expose this criminal world government takeover that is to be funded with at least $100 trillion every decade off of carbon taxes, with Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, most of the British leadership, Obama, the Rothschilds, the other classic elitist names, the Soroses, all standing to make billions apiece per year off of all of your carbon activity. Now, because they haven't been able to implement this all over the United States, I see it in Austin, I see it in San Francisco, particularly so-called liberal areas. That means brainwashed cult member, anti-liberal areas, zombie areas, fascist areas, slave areas where people love being slaves. They have carbon indulgences on their car, like you're paying it to the Vatican to stay out of hell or something, you know, Cicero 800 years ago. And it says, I pay a carbon tax to this private company. And then they offset what I'm doing, planting trees or whatever. And of course, it turns out almost all of that's a giant scam as well. But this is just where you pay for carbon taxes directly to the London and Chicago and Frankfurt mercantiles and the Paris mercantiles for a giant commodities screw job. A global commodities tax run and operated by private interest, tax exempt with diplomatic immunity. Of course they want to arrest you if you call these criminals. Simply mind-blowing. I mean, we told you it was coming. They have personally said that I should be arrested in major British newspapers. They say it on a weekly basis about Lord Monckton. They talk about Mark Moreno. They actually had wanted signs in Paris when he premiered his film a few months ago there in Paris. And you're like, oh, they're just joking around. No, they're not. You saw what happened in Sacramento. Two idiot groups in a fight with each other. But here's the difference. At least the neo-Nazis were anti-globalists and understand this country's being captured. The useful idiot, racist BAM group, by any means necessary, that's really an anti-white group from my research, they ran around and began beating people with sticks and hitting them over the head. And so, wow, the white nationalists stabbed them back. And so I'll tell you who's in the wrong here. It's the communists. And by the way, they are so Ford Foundation funded, it is just ridiculous. The image of the police, though, in their black uniforms, taking photos of who's stabbing who and who's hitting who. We're showing that right now on TV for TV viewers. Please never forget, if you're a new listener, we're not just radio. We like to add an added dimension of documentation. Infowars.com/show, and TV stations around the country, cable stations, starting to pick up the show. I haven't really gone to that phase of launch yet because I've been so busy getting new reporters and adding crew. But we've got cable station in Houston and some UHF and VHF and cable stations around the country. It's more than 20 right now I know of, but we're about to do a big push and get hundreds. A lot of it's also funding, but I'm going to digress from there. Everybody knows InfoWars is exponentially growing and reaching more people, especially when it comes to the internet itself. That's why the federal government, bought out by foreign interest, isn't just pushing with the Democrats to arrest people that talk about man-made global warming being a tax scam fraud. They are also coming out and pushing taxing by the mile with the magic boxes in the last 14, 15 years or so that magically fell into all the cars manufactured from North America to Europe to Japan to South Korea to China. Global standardization by accident of little boxes that you pay for as part of the cost of the car to tax you by the mile, but they're also going to keep the gas tax on top of it. I've been telling you that for 20 years. It's now started in Europe. It's now started in many states like Oregon. Now the Washington Post announces the whole East Coast is about to go together in a giant screw job of epic proportions. And the attack on free speech just accelerates. But we're going to be looking at all of that. Speaking of the devil, ABC News reports, here's the headline, UN says more Central Americans headed to U.S., and right down in McAllen, Texas, where two of our reporters are today and are going to be coming on the broadcast, incidentally, where two of our reporters are right now, they just announced, oh, yeah, there's hundreds of thousands from Latin America. They just show up. They're illegal, the newscast admits, but then they're just set up at the bus station by the Border Patrol, and then they get given vouchers and they get sent to different areas of the country, just released out into the open, but sent to Democratic Party facilities to be set up, put on welfare, given driver's license. Remember a flashback about this 2 years ago, back in June of 2014? Jakari Jackson and others showed you them admitting all this. Of course, I can't go to Honduras. I can't go to Chile. I can't go to Central or South America and get anything free. But it's like, oh, it's families with children and their husbands, of course, and others. Yeah, 70% are children. And it doesn't matter if Kevin Pagan, emergency management, person thinks it's okay. It's not. And no one covered this but Drudge 2 years ago. And now it's, oh, in the local news, oh, we're just being loving, we're helping. And then don't forget this headline from a few months ago. It just ties in. Obama administration and UN announced global police force to fight extremism in U.S. The Strong Cities Initiative, and they're suing Arpaio and others that if a drunk driver happens to be illegal, he takes them to jail, and that's mean. So isn't that just precious? Isn't that just the cutest thing you've ever seen in your life? This is it. People say, oh, the UN doesn't run things. The U.S. and Europe do. Yes, the UN is the multinational group with the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, where multinational corporations set up boards, and then they get governments to consolidate power into unions, and then those unions waive their power to dictatorial, unelected, secret corporate boards. And the EU Parliament is admittedly ceremonial, has no power. It's advisory. And then now the EU announced Sunday, Soros came out and said, quote, we need to have an emergency reconstitution. First, the EU needs to go down, but then it needs to be reconstituted into a super state. And guess what? The proposal is now out. The Polish newspapers have gotten the proposal from The Hague in the Netherlands. And guess what it says? Members that are still in are having their governments dissolved and their militaries dissolved and are going under EU command. The militaries will still stand, but will now have EU commanders. That's just like when the Germans came into France and left the French army in place, but put their commanders in place. Because the public went along with it. They were called the Vichy French. And I hammer that because Germany didn't really beat France in 2 weeks. They didn't just really run over the Maginot Line and the Blitzkrieg. They had a deal with almost the entire general staff of the French to take over and turn power over to them and set it up in the south of France, and they did. But that's barely in the history books. It's an absolute incontrovertible fact. But that's what globalism is. Most of war is using your intelligence agencies to buy off foreign governments before you invade. That's what they did to Iraq in 1991 and 2003. And then they have Panetta, the former head of the CIA, come out when Trump talks about it and go, we didn't pay anybody off in Iraq. That's ridiculous. They paid Iraq off upwards of $60 billion, admittedly, before, during, and after that so-called invasion in the first year. That's admitted. But that's how dumb they think you are. And that's what they've done here. They've come in and bought off the government, and we're openly going under world government, and they have an Atlantic Treaty merging the NAU that was signed in secret in 2005 in Baylor University in Waco, Texas, by Vicente Fox, Paul Martin, and George W. Bush. And it was even in the local paper. They signed a treaty. It's secret. Then 2 years later, they are having the Banff meeting to ratify it in secret. Judicial Watch sues, gets 2,000 plus pages. I actually read or scanned all 2,000 pages and made the film Endgame. And I show the pages with them admitting stealth integration to world government with the goals of the total corporate rule, with the corporations voting, and then having the heads of state agree executively to follow it. And I made the film Endgame. Talk about sensational. That's how this works. That's how the TPP works. That's how all this works, and it's being done out in the open now. And their answer is now to hold Europe hostage and plunge their stock market. They're already plunging the stock market. You know, Soros is running around saying British exit makes EU disintegration irreversible. But again, on the ashes of it, he wants to build a superstate.